This is a presentation I gave in front of a large group of realtors in North Carolina talking about the recent National Association of Realtors settlement, what it actually said, what it doesn't say, and what it means for their profession. I hope you enjoy it. I know that for the last month, this has been heavy on everybody's minds, mostly because all of the headlines are sensationalizing things. And if you have ever met me or talked to me for any length of time, you know I am not a sensationalist. So I want you to know what the settlement really says, because I read it. I read it so you didn't have to. I brought it with me. I should have printed it single-sided so it looked more ominous and more impressive, but it is double-sided. You know, if you were to have it single-sided, it would look like, it's way harder to read. But it's a dense document. And I would not expect someone that hasn't, even if you're an attorney, if you haven't participated in litigation even, to maybe understand all the nuances there. So some of this is going to be extremely nerdy. It's going to be like terms that you probably don't deal with often, or if you have, you probably would like to pretend that you didn't, because it means you've been involved in litigation of some sort. But I think it's really critical that you understand how everything plays together, because when your clients start asking you about it, if you know the facts versus what the media might be saying or what someone's Uncle Joe is telling them, then you can educate a lot better, and then make it a little bit easier for you to display, your worth and the value that you bring to the transaction. So first, like I said, knowing the facts makes a big difference. So let's figure out how we got here. A lot of people only know the history of the case as it has been shown on the news. And unfortunately, most of those headlines are either wildly incorrect or they're so distilled down that it misses a lot of the nuance. So this case started in Missouri in federal court in 2019. So this has been going on for 5 years. It's been talked about even longer than that. And the allegations in this lawsuit were that there was a conspiracy among agents to set commissions illegally at 6% and require all sellers to pay a commission to the buyer's agent. There might have been a handful of agents in Missouri doing that, but we in North Carolina know that's not how we do things. Our documents are incredibly clear to that effect. So unfortunately, some of these facts that are happening in other states where things aren't done how they're done in North Carolina are having this terrible ripple effect to our state as well. Even though this is not how we do things here, there were allegations that there were agents in Missouri doing that. So, fast forward 5 years of extremely expensive litigation for both sides and a jury verdict nearing $1.8 billion, yes, billion with a B. Post the jury verdict, the parties got back together and said, listen, if we're being serious, the National Association of Realtors is not going to be able to pay $1.8 billion in any meaningful amount of time. We are going to appeal, so let's talk about settlement. So one thing to know about litigation is that a jury verdict isn't the end unless the defendant gives up. You have remedies to exhaust over and over again. So it's very easy that when you see the headline of $1.8 billion jury verdict, that gets people really riled up and they're like, oh, real estate agents, they're dead in the water. No, not until all of the remedies have been exhausted. So that would have been appealed. And if they lost that appeal, they would have taken it to the Supreme Court and asked for certiorari. It would have kept going another several years. So the purpose of the settlement is to end the money spent on attorneys, and just have some true finality to this so that it didn't keep going for multiple years. The other thing to know about this, class action. There's a lot of confusing things about class action. So a lot of consumers think that everybody is a part of the class action. I've bought a house before, so I'm part of this class, and I'm going to get my $42 or probably less than that payout from this settlement. But the class was certified in 2022, and the impact of class certification is that it doesn't mean that the defendants are wrong. What it means is that there are enough people that if the allegations are true, it would be way too expensive to litigate the cases individually. So it's a way to kind of, the thing they talk about in law school is the economies of justice. So every person that would have had these similar harms, if those things were true, would have had to bring a case. They would have had to hire their own lawyer. There would have been separate sets of discovery, meaning obtaining all the documents, doing depositions, et cetera, et cetera. So you're looking at these defendants being deposed, I don't know, 4,000, 10,000 times if you were to do all those things separately. So the purpose of a class action is to say, all right, to keep all of these cases from clouding the courts, if all of the plaintiffs want to bring their case, we're just going to put them all together. So who was in the class? The class included, as of the class certification in 2022, any person who sold a home within the preceding 4 years using one of the 4 MLSs named in the lawsuit. North Carolina was not named in the lawsuit. So there are not people in North Carolina, unless they sold a house in Missouri or one of those other states where the 4 MLSs were named, that are part of the class. So the class is quite small compared to what it might seem like in the news. This settlement, if it is approved, is going to wrap up not just the Burnett and Sitzer cases, which are kind of the ones getting all of the attention, but 2 other similar cases that are related. So the goal of this settlement is to really bring finality and get something done so that you guys can all have a little bit of peace about like not constantly having your profession sued for stupid stuff. So the next thing is who is released. So it's really important to understand who is released. And I know it's extremely nerdy, and I know it's down in the nitty gritty, but not everybody is released in this settlement. So first, the National Association of Realtors and its members, Realtor MLSs, so meaning the MLSs that are controlled by NAR members, non-Realtor MLSs, and please nobody tell on me for not including that trademark symbol behind Realtor and not capitalizing it. Nobody turn me in. And then also real estate brokerages with a 2022 transaction volume of less than $2 billion. Okay. So these are the people that are covered as being released. You will have no further liability, but it's not just those things. You have to also, beyond just being in one of those categories, you have to comply with the terms of the settlement, which are extensive. And then, depending on which of those bullet points you are, for example, a non-realtor MLS, or if you're a real estate brokerage with more than $2 billion in volume in 2022, that involves some payment. There are different ways to calculate it. So if you want to be released under this settlement, there are some bullet points that would require payment that could be big. All right, so what are they really suing about? And pardon me, I've got some notes on my phone because this thing is, it's dense, and I don't want to forget to tell you something important. The main issues in the litigation are the cooperative compensation model. So there are, the allegations in the lawsuit are that, the real estate agents are conspiring everywhere so that the commissions are always set at 6%. Lies, and that you always have to pay the buyer's agent, as if there was no choice in the matter. And then the plaintiffs were also concerned, their thoughts, and remember, don't shoot the messenger, just relaying the information of what they were alleging here, is that, why should a seller have to pay a buyer's agent? They didn't do anything for me, other than make it so that you could get your house sold and have a buyer to buy it. But that's what they're saying, is that person didn't provide services to me. I didn't enter into an agreement with them. Why should I be required to pay them? So regardless of where your thoughts are on the matter, those were in fact the allegations. Now, one of the things about allegation versus fact, and I don't remember if I have this on a later slide, is that an allegation is something that someone says that they then have to prove in order to win a lawsuit. A fact, we all know what that is. But one of the problems with this whole thing is that the allegations are being set forth as facts, and that's what the consumers hear. So they hear that the plaintiffs alleged that realtors were conspiring to set commissions at 6%, and you didn't have a choice but to pay the buyer's agent. You know that an allegation is not a fact. They don't. So this is going to be a talking point. They're going to say, oh, I saw that, that what you guys were doing. No, that's what the plaintiffs in Missouri alleged were happening in Missouri. Okay. So it's very important that you guys keep that in mind. And you talk about what really happens in North Carolina, where you're really doing business, where they're selling their houses. So let's talk about what changes. Some of these things are like idea type things, which are the challenges to the traditional views on agent compensation. I'd put traditional in air quotes, in quotes, because If you've been doing anything that's business for any length of time, it's always changing. So there's not so much really anything traditional. You might have a good 6-year run where you're like, okay, things are not really changing much. And then bam, something will hit you. And now we're doing something different. Another thing that the settlement itself, wants to really put forth in what they consider a change is that the negotiability of commissions has to be very prominent. We already do that. Our documents already spell that out very clearly. Other thing, requirement for written agreements with buyer clients. Guess what? We also already do that. We have probably one of the best buyer agency agreements in the country. I get a lot of comments on the YouTube video about this, which Ryan's probably going to fuss at me because I was supposed to mention that. Part of the reason why I know a lot about this is because we put it out on the YouTube channel, like 64,000 people watched it. It's like a thing. And a lot of agents from other states are like, oh my gosh, this is going to tank us. Like, we don't have a buyer agency agreement. We've never had to do that. And that kind of is wild to me, having started real estate in North Carolina and only ever having come up in an area or in an age where there's buyer agency agreement. That talks about how you get paid, even if there's no compensation offered from the listing side. The other thing is that because there has been a custom of sellers paying compensation to buyers agents, there's going to be a little bit of a change in how buyers agents work to make sure that they're not working for free. So one of the biggest highlights here, and this is where people are going to argue with you and tell you, well, the settlement said this, so you must have been doing it, is that the National Association of Realtors will eliminate or prohibit any requirement that listing brokers or sellers must make offers of compensation to buyer brokers. That already wasn't a requirement, not the way we do business. But this kind of is the highlight of why it might have been easier for the settlement to be reached. Because of this 108 pages, there might be 3 to 4 paragraphs that might change how we do things in North Carolina. Most of it is reiterating the existing policies that we already abide by. So it is not that difficult to say, yes, we'll agree to all of your changes when they were already standards. So that is one thing that I think has been blown way out of proportion is, well, how it must have been bad if they would have agreed to these 35 pages of practice changes. Well, that's because they're not practice changes. In every profession, there are bad apples. There are probably a few bad apples in Missouri that got us here. But just like, you guys probably hate those class action attorneys. It's not all attorneys, just like it's not all agents. So that's what you're going to have to keep in mind whenever these people are saying, but the lawsuit, the settlement, of course it's true if you enter into a settlement. Another thing to keep in mind about litigation is that, unfortunately, anybody can sue at any time for any reason, whether it's a good reason or not. So just because something is alleged in a lawsuit doesn't mean that it's true. It has to be, carried out all the way to a verdict. It has to be proven through discovery. So that's another thing that to keep in your back pocket of how litigation works, and that just because somebody sues doesn't mean they win. Heaven forbid anybody in this room has ever been sued wrongfully. You know that just because somebody says it in a complaint doesn't mean that it's real. Okay, the next thing, and this is the hot one, and it's the prohibition of using the MLS to make offers of compensation to buyer's agents. The beautiful thing about the settlement, though, is that there was explicitly carved out a loophole in multiple ways. So one, it's that you can still make the offers of compensation. You just can't make them through the MLS anymore. I know that was a very convenient way to do it. That means we got to innovate a little bit. How else are we going to be able to make those offers of compensation if you want to? So it's not that they can't be offered. It's got to be done a different way. And the other thing is that there's like multiple pages dedicated in this settlement to talking about, well, should there happen to be another website where you could look up an address and see an offer of compensation, as long as the MLS isn't promulgating it, as long as they're not intentionally feeding data to that website, we have no problem with it. So they didn't have to put that in there. All they could have just said is prohibition, no offers of compensation. But the fact that they took several pages to put hypotheticals out there of if just maybe these other things were happening, as long as the MLS isn't in charge of it, we're okay. So that's another thing to keep in mind. There's going to be a lot of innovation there. I'm already hearing about it like all over the place of ideas that people have to make it easier to find if there are offers of compensation. The other thing is that the realtor MLSs, if they want to be released, same thing with the non-realtor MLSs, if they want to be released, any fields that are for the purpose of listing broker compensation to offers to buyers agents got to be removed. And you're prohibited from trying to sneak it in any other field. So, yes, they did. They knew where you guys might go with that. So that is not just using percentages or numbers. That's code words. That's, like you come up with a code word that means, hey, we're going to pay you 2.5%. Like they're going to figure you out. So just know that you can't use any of the other fields for that purpose either. Some other things to think about here too are the buyer agency agreements. The settlement, I know that we have buyer agency agreements. I know you enter into them, but I also know that sometimes that's not prior to properties being shown. You get that call and you've got like somebody that wants to go see a property now. You get in the car and you start driving, right? You don't say, hold on, let me get out my computer. Is it even charged? Let me get to the agreement. Let's talk about what you're going to pay me. And they're like, wait, I got to go see this property. That's going to be changing a little bit because one of the practice changes is that the buyer agency agreements, they want them signed before you show a property. So before you step foot into that first showing, the buyer agency agreement, according to the settlement, needs to be signed. I don't know how they're going to police that. Well, I do know. We'll get to that in a minute. I don't know that they actually will follow through on policing it. But another thing that the settlement says, and you guys, I know you're probably rolling your eyes here like, we already do this. I know. That's why it's important for you to know what the settlement says so you know how mostly not big of a deal it is. There are a few very big things, and there's 90% of things that you already do every single day that don't change how you work at all. But the agreements have to clearly state how the compensation is going to be determined. Our form already gives you options for that. So one thing that is very clearly spelled out in the settlement document is that you can't just vaguely hint. You have to be able to determine a number by reading the text of the document. It can't be contingent upon some future thing possibly happening. And what I mean by that is you can't say commission will be whatever seller is offering to pay buyer's agent. You have to be able to say determine an actual amount from that agreement. So if it ends up being that you're going to get 3%, whatever you decide, you have to be able to get to a number from that. It can't just be contingent on saying, well, if the seller decides to pay me something, that's what I'll get paid. So the buyer needs to know at the end what your commission will be. The other thing is that you cannot say the words that your services are free unless you are truly not getting paid at all. Okay. So you cannot advertise that, hey, it's, why would you not use a buyer's agent? It's free for you. Gosh, that's how Ben Thomas taught me. He was like, my goodness, I don't know why anybody would never use a buyer's agent. They don't have to pay. That kind of language, unfortunately, does fuel a little bit of these allegations, okay? So you have to be very careful moving forward to not say something like, okay, it's free to work with a buyer's agent, unless, in fact, you will not be making a dime off the deal. And I know y'all don't want to work for free, so please be careful in how you use that language going forward. Next, the disclosure about commissions. This is another big eye roll. So you have to be able to inform sellers and buyers that commissions are not set by law, that they are fully negotiable. Our documents already do that. And in fact, I think they've got a black box around them to call out commissions are negotiable. If they don't, and if I'm misremembering, the settlement is going to make that a requirement. And the purpose of that is we got into this litigation because of uneducated consumers. If you dive into the discovery in this lawsuit, you will probably get outraged. So I'm begging you not to do that if you would like to not be angry all day. But I will I will give you one piece of just some information that came out in discovery that hopefully you'll be able to work off the anger by the time, Barry and Dawn get up and, you won't be seething anymore. But one of the depositions, there was one of these plaintiffs were deposed and they were saying, okay, well, Let's talk about how you got to this point of saying you didn't have a choice, that you were required to pay 6%, that you had to pay a buyer commission or a buyer agent commission. And so they talked about their agent, who they were working with. Their agent presented them options. They gave them tiers of, okay, if I do this, it will be this percent. If I do this, it will be a lower percent. They gave them 3 different options. And that seller said, I don't want to pay that much. I don't want to pay that. And the agent said, okay, we may not be a good fit for each other. That's okay. Like, there are lots of other good agents that maybe you'll find someone that will, you'll be able to pay what you want to pay, but it is not going to be me. And they did so respectfully, saying, like, these are my options. If you want to work with me, this is what you can use. And that person alleged that they felt like they didn't have a choice in the matter. As if we don't know how many people went out there and got their license during COVID, that like there's more choices than there should be, So they absolutely had a choice in the matter, but they're saying because, I ended up just going with the lower tier because I felt like I didn't have any other choice. And they said, well, everybody else pays the buyer's agent this much percent. So if you want to have a good chance of marketing your property, then you have to do that. That's how all of this came out. And it would probably, it enraged me. So I imagine you're probably a little ticked off too. And the fact that all that person was doing, all that agent was doing was saying, this is my value. This is what I'm worth. These are the services I will provide, and this is what it will cost you. And if you don't want to pay any of these options, you can go look elsewhere. And it's not being a jerk. It's just saying, if you want to work with me, this is what it costs. It's no different than what attorneys do. You have options for closing attorneys, some of them more expensive than others, like every single one we get, we're thankful for. But if someone doesn't want to pay our fee, we understand. And there are other closing attorneys that might be more in line with what they're expecting. So far, we're not getting sued for that. So unfortunately, maybe a few bad apples in Missouri are how we got here. Next thing to know, in the future, these practice changes, again, most of them not being changes, are set to expire 7 years after the class notice date. That is defined very carefully in the settlement agreement. But it is probably something that people are like, 7 years? I thought this was a forever thing. It's not. Nothing in real estate is a forever thing, just like the settlement is not. One of the things that's required here is that the settlement hasn't been approved by the judge yet. We got notice that the settlement was coming on March 15th. The document, I don't want to say leaked. It was coming out anyway. It just hadn't been filed with the court yet, like the very next day. So there are some things that have to happen before class notice occurs. And that's, the filing with the court plus 30 days, etc. And that's how we get to that mid-July date. Everybody's saying, oh, this all takes effect in mid-July. That's all contingent on the class notice date, which I don't know off the top of my head. I'll look it up after this. The class notice date may be coming up very soon, and then you've got like a 90-day period. But if the settlement had been filed on March 15th, the day that we heard about it, then that would have put the class or the effective date mid-July. It wasn't filed on March 15th. So that's going to be pushed a little bit. So it's still probably going to be sometime in July, early August at the latest. But as of when this was all coming out, there wasn't a firm date on that. But once that class notice date happens, which is probably coming up soon in the next couple weeks, then we're looking at 7 years of bliss until the next thing happens, right? Now, here is something that I find incredibly interesting, and this is why I was saying, I don't know if they're going to go to the lengths to police this, but the National Association of Realtors and all released parties, which includes the people sitting in this room, if you are a member of the National Association of Realtors, agreed to provide significant cooperation in ongoing litigation. So that means if your documents are subpoenaed, you're not putting up a fight to not give them over. That means being deposed. Now, the likelihood that anybody in this room is ever going to get a subpoena for documents or asked to be deposed, it's like infinitesimal. They're really worried about the National Association of Realtors and their employees. That's what they care about here. But if you're talking about putting together a settlement that makes people happy, they're going to grab, they're saying, okay, well, we got cooperation from all the released parties. That's going to make our plaintiffs happy. But the attorneys, they're not calling you guys. This is not the locus of where the problem even happened. So they're going to be looking, if anything, agents in Missouri and the other 4 locales where the cases. But it's important that you know that, what the settlement actually says. Also, not just during the litigation, but how will they find out if you've entered into a buyer agency agreement before showing property? By asking to see the signed buyer agency agreement. So they're retaining the right in this document to see evidence of your compliance with the terms of this settlement if you want to remain a release party. So again, the likelihood of this might be low, but in the off chance this is actually employed and used and you don't have good records, that's going to be a problem. Because if you want to remain released under this, you're going to need to be able to prove compliance if called upon to do so. Again, I don't think that's an extremely high likelihood. I don't have the current numbers of how many members are in the National Association of Realtors, but I believe the cost just to prove this compliance would be through the roof. But it's always a good idea to keep good records, this settlement being yet another reason to keep good records. All right, what stays the same? Everything else. Everything else stays the same. And I already talked about this fact and allegation difference. I am so grateful finally to be, somebody who's lived in North Carolina all my life because I don't know if anybody's ever seen Community. If not, ignore this reference, but we are streets ahead of all of the other states when it comes to being ready for this. So that's Chevy Chase's character that he uses that to say like, oh, we're way far ahead of everybody else. And it doesn't make any sense, but that is what he says. Because our forms anticipated this a long time ago. We're ready for this and you guys are trained on it. What becomes difficult going forward is it is going to change the custom of how we've done business. It's another thing to keep in mind is the difference between a requirement and a conspiracy and a custom. Just because something is customary in a market doesn't mean that it's wrong or illegal. All right, so coming to the point that is really kind of the meat of the matter is explaining this to the consumer. So you've just gotten a bunch of nerdy stuff about what the lawsuit really says and what it doesn't. You guys are exceptional at taking complex concepts and explaining it to people who never touch them. You do it every day in how you explain how you buy a house, working with lenders, working with inspectors, what is escrow, etc. So you are already well prepared to take this concept and translate it to your client. Worst case, if you get tripped up, there is a video on the internet under the real estate lawyer that can help you with that. Just saying, if I don't tell you that, Ryan's going to be upset. Now, here's something that I am concerned about when it comes to like putting the pieces together. And I think it's going to be really important for you guys to do your part here. What I fear, and I hope I end up being completely wrong about this, I'll celebrate that. But I think that there is a chance for this settlement to open up potential discrimination by sellers. And that is because, that perhaps an offer of compensation is made to one agent and not another, or one buyer and their agent, but not another buyer for whatever reason that may be. If that person is being discriminated against and they're in a protected class, that's bad stuff. That's really bad stuff. And it's our job as fiduciaries to make sure that's not happening. So especially if you are a listing agent and you have a client who's saying, well, I don't know that I want this person buying my house. I don't know that they'll be a good neighbor. You have to be very careful to counsel sellers, hey, you're about to step in a discrimination pit. So it's not that you can't tell them, well, if you're going to make it to one, you have to make it to all. That's part of what the lawsuit is about. We can't say that, but you have to make darn sure that you're telling them that if you're deciding not to offer compensation to the buyer's agents, it cannot be for a discriminatory reason. It cannot be. And often discriminatory reasons are not that hard to suss out. So if you're going to offer, if you say 9 buyers come along or, 10 buyers come along and 9 of them you offer to commission to the buyer's agent, and then the one person that doesn't look like the rest, you decide not to offer to them as a disincentive for them to buy the house, that's going to open up all kinds of stuff for discrimination. I've heard there's already stuff in the works to try to help VA buyers and buyers in other programs where they're not permitted to pay certain things. I don't have a ton of details on that yet. So I know that as that develops, we'll probably be convening, whether it's virtually or in person, to talk about that again. But that is yet another thing that we have to think about is, all right, if a VA buyer can't pay your commission, you can't work for free. I mean, you got to make a living. So there are going to be things that will change to help that. So what we do here in our state is really not going to change that much. The other thing is the market always tells us what it wants. That's the free market will always make its point. So if you get a bunch of sellers that are like, awesome, I am not going to pay any commissions to buyer's agents, the market will very quickly tell us if it will tolerate that. So the same thing on like if buyers decide, I don't want to take the risk of having to pay the commission at closing, like I'm already like kind of tight on my savings, the market is going to very quickly tell us if it can sustain that. I am thinking that it won't be that long of this settlement taking effect and sellers trying to say, oh man, I'm going to save a whole bunch of money, to find out that they're also not really going to make as much money. It's going to be a lot more difficult to get buyers. Their houses may not be selling for what they were hoping. Now, this is where you have to be extremely careful, because while I think that the market will make its point rather quickly, you have to be extremely careful as a buyer's agent to not refuse to show properties that you're not sure whether there's an offer of compensation. You know, that's part of the lack of transparency now with being able to see it on the MLS. You know, if there aren't other innovations to make it so that you can find out, all right, is there an offer here? If you are categorically refusing to show properties where you're not 100% sure that the seller is going to pay your commission, you could be stepping in it. All right. So you have to be extremely careful that you don't refuse to show properties that are either not offering compensation or that you cannot determine easily if they are. That's why the buyer's agency agreement is going to be critical, because that's how you know that you're going to get paid. You have to communicate that value up front very clearly so that your buyers understand everything that you do for them and why it's worth it being a line item on the closing statement on their side. I don't know if you guys saw, like on our Instagram, it was a clip from our podcast where we were talking about like just the immense value in buyer's agents. Ryan does a great job of like cutting out stuff like that to make it easier for you to share, because sometimes I know your people want to hear it from a different voice. So I'm happy to be that voice. So we got stuff like that out there for you to share if you feel like it is helpful for you, or if you even just want to refresh on what we've talked about here today. I think we'll probably see more so in other markets than here, like alternative compensation models that already exist. It's not gonna be as if these things are brand new. It's just not super common here, but potentially compensation models based on, you know, think about like an attorney that doesn't do flat fee where you get paid by the hour, or some litigation attorneys work by the stage, you know, like you'll pay me this much if we get it settled through a demand letter. You'll pay me this much if we're in discovery. You'll pay me this much if it has to go to trial. I could see something like that happening with buyer's agents as well. But again, I think because North Carolina was so prepared for this, and not necessarily because they saw this lawsuit and the settlement coming, but because they wanted to protect our North Carolina agents from situations where they wouldn't get paid and they'd work for free. But because we were prepared for this, I don't know that we'll have as many of those alternative compensation models. Certainly possible. It's kind of a new-ish world, so anything could happen. But, you know, the main thing that I want you to take away from this is, you guys already know not to get swayed by the headlines, but how do you communicate it to your buyers and sellers so that they are not getting lost in the headlines as well? So knowing fact versus fiction, what did the settlement really say? When does it really take effect? When does it really end? And who is truly affected by it? You know, these North Carolina buyers, just let them know, no, you're not getting a settlement check. And also, if you did, it's like $4. So most of that is going to the class action attorneys anyway. Hopefully you picked up something from that presentation about what the settlement actually did and did not say. If you got any value out of that, subscribe to our channel. We put out more videos just like this to keep you educated on real estate.